Perfect. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our field experience webinar. My name is Jen Dwight. I am our senior client advisor here at Salis, and I will be your moderator. So, anybody has questions, please, you can chat me directly. You can chat the group. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to introduce my two colleagues. Jack Mazenson and Megan Reether will be kicking us off in this implementation, not in this implementation, in this webinar about implementations. They've both been with us over 10 years and have worked 60 plus implementations worldwide, and we're going to learn all about it. We welcome questions. If you could type them, please make sure you're on mute. This will be recording. Lori, that's a cue to click that beautiful record button. And we will get the slides out to
Already
you.
done. Already done, Jen.
Perfect. We'll get the slides and recording out to you. So thank you so much for joining us. Jack, Megan, please. Oh, Brad, did you want to say something? I apologize. Nope, just waving. Hi there. All right, Jack, Megan, take us
Yep,
away.
sure. So I'll just really quickly introduce myself. My name is Jack Mazenson. I'm Director of Implementations at Salis. My primary role is making sure that for all of our clients, we're able to understand kind of how you work and to match the platform's capabilities to how you work, make it work for you. And this is basically an entire presentation about that and how we have been doing that for over 10 years. And so this is going to, include a lot of stuff about sort of the early years of the product, when we were first implementing it for UNICEF around the world. I know there's going to be sort of in the audience, there's going to be a mix of people working in international contexts and also in US, Canada. So one thing we're going to try to do as we go through this presentation is work to kind of talk about how, how this particular context may seem a little bit different, but this is really how it plays into, how you're going to use a platform and how you can use digital case management tools to make your work better. That's my quick intro. Megan, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I'll just introduce myself because I think Jack did a great job of explaining what we're going to do here. But Megan Reether, I'm a project manager here, and I make the trains run on time, but also contribute a lot to the same kind of things that Jack is talking about, helping people understand their process and understand the tools and how they can work better together. So let's get started.
Okay. All right, so let me know if people end up having trouble seeing the slides as I am transitioning them. So I wanted to include this slide just to give a little bit of background, what we meant by field experience, right? That term can mean a lot of stuff. A lot of this really pertains to our work implementing Salis around the globe. So to give background for people who aren't familiar with this, so Salis leverages an open source application which we have been developing for UNICEF since 2013, developing and maintaining. So this open source version of the platform, Primero, is used by 20,000 plus caseworkers in 70 plus countries around the world in 40 plus languages and dialects. So it is a really wide scope of different use cases and different teams in different places using this platform for case management. Our first live implementation was in Sierra Leone in 2015 during the Ebola outbreak, which explains the not quite a color-corrected picture that I've included in there from that initial implementation trip. So that was a very interesting trial by fire for how this system is going to work for a sort of a national network of ministries and non-governmental organizations responding to all the consequences of a pretty dire public health crisis. So, beyond that, our experience implementing the system also spans 5 continents and all kinds of use cases from public health interventions, with public health ministries to domestic violence mitigation. Uh, so that's just a bit of background on that.
Yeah, so now that you have kind of that background on our experience, I want to ground us first. The most important thing to remember, I think, both as we go along today and also more broadly, if and as you find yourself on a digital case management implementation journey, is that you are the expert on your clients. You know your client population, you know what they need from you, you know how you're currently making that happen. Digital case management tools and those of us who implement them can help you hone that process. We can help you turn that into actionable data. We've definitely seen the way that different organizations meet their clients' needs and understand the way that a tool can commonly be adapted. So we have different but kind of complementary areas of expertise in this arena. Jack, if you give me the next slide.
Yep.
So we've organized ourselves into some categories here, about four basic categories, roughly corresponding to the kind of work that you would do if you were actually engaged in implementation of digital case management for your organization. So that's process analysis. How do you work? What's the human process that grounds what you currently do? Data management. What kind of data do you collect? How do you collect it? What are you doing with it? Localization, which for us here is understanding what's unique about your context and what's needed to adapt a tool to that context. And then capacity building, training and ongoing learning, resource expansion, developing skills, and strengthening them over time. Um, for each of those categories, I think as Jack sort of alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, we have an overview of some common practices, maybe some potential pitfalls, examples from our well of experience. So let's dive in on the first topic, which is process analysis. Um, Everything starts here. If your mission is being carried out in some form on a daily basis, there is a process that's already underpinning the work that you do, whether or not you've clearly defined it. Organizations often do process, but don't discuss it, meaning that folks know how to do their jobs, but may not have a shared vocabulary to explain what they do or why. On more than one occasion, I have sat down with leaders at an organization to start thinking about process analysis and watched in real time as they discover that their business processes are way less standardized than they assumed. Folks can so easily be stymied by that discovery, but I think if everybody approaches that conversation with curiosity and with some willingness to evolve, then implementing a digital tool actually can start some really important conversations about process at your organization. Metaphorically speaking, if you've always just driven a car by default and never taken the time to explore whether a bike might actually be a better choice for your needs in a specific moment, this experience is absolutely going to give you the opportunity to weigh the pros and cons, make an informed decision about that. It's the perfect time to be thoughtful about what you're already doing, what's working, what could be improved, maybe what could be unified across your organization, or some stuff that you've never considered before. Um, no matter what those conversations turn up, the process has to stand on its own outside of the context of the tool. You want the tool to better facilitate your process. Um, yeah, there you go. So when considering a digital tool in the context of your existing processes, you're starting with what you know. You're asking things like where, when, how is this going to help us? Maybe what are the pain points that technology might be able to help us resolve? What kind of technical constraints are we aware of? Are we already working with? So I think Jack is going to walk us through the workflow mapping on this screen as an example.
Yeah, so this is an example that I pulled from an implementation we did in Bangladesh back in 2018. So in this particular situation, we were or UNICEF and its partners were responding to the Rohingya refugee crisis. And if it's not something that you're familiar with, it's basically there's sort of a persecuted ethnic religious group within Myanmar that had fled across the border. And I think at the time, I think it was the largest refugee camp in the world was on the Bangladeshi side. And so what you had was a situation where UNICEF and all these other groups were trying desperately to, you know, register a lot of these refugees and then provide services for them. And for UNICEF and its partners, there was a particular focus on families and children, right? Um, Now, there was also, there were also like pretty bad connectivity conditions out in these camps. And so, not necessarily consistent power in the surrounding areas. And so there was this question of, all right, well, you have this digital tool, right? How are you going to make sure that when people are using it, they're actually able to use it because it's a web app, right? And so part of what we did here was we just talked to people, right? We said, you know, first for when you are registering a case, and that's that kind of first section up top, and then also for when you're doing case management, where are you when you do these things? Like, where do you start your day, right? Like, you wake up at home, do you go to the office or do you just go out to the camps? A lot of these caseworkers, they wouldn't even go into the office. They'd maybe go into the office 1 day a week. They'd basically take a motorcycle out to the camps, right? And they would be registering or, checking in on some of the cases. And again, not really predictable connectivity. So a lot of people are offline when they're doing this work. So if they're going to have the application on their phone, it needs to work offline, right? This helped us figure out, okay, this is where you're starting. This is what you have to do on a daily basis, right? Um, where does the technology need to meet you? It's not about saying like, you absolutely 100% have to use this technology at absolutely every single step of the way. But it is saying like, if we want this tool to come in and help you do your work, we need to make sure that it's going to hold up under the conditions that you're dealing with. So this is an example of you start off with the human process, right? You can even see here, we tried to map out like, how are these cases identified? Sometimes it's through like youth or adolescent groups. So, just sports teams that are organized in the camps. Sometimes local religious leaders would identify children. Sometimes this is information that's coming in from an external organization, and you can see that for each one of these scenarios, we've tried to plot out: are you in the office where you're going to have internet, or are you in the field, out in a scenario where you don't have proper internet and a lot of technology around you and running power and things like that. But yeah. Okay, I'm going to keep going with some more examples here. And for this one, I kind of want to talk about how talking through the process can help actually build the process. Megan was talking about this with, you may have always driven a car, but then if you actually talk through it, maybe a bike is the more practical thing, depending on where you are. Um, my I always joke about my wife has this peach cake recipe that she likes to make that was passed down by her grandmother. And her grandmother had made this recipe for years and years and years and just done it by heart and just kind of thrown the ingredients together and made it. And then my wife tried to get her to write it down, and the recipe kept on coming out terribly. And eventually, by talking about it with her grandmother and doing it, she realized, oh, actually, you're using way more butter than you think you're using. So talking through it can actually reveal a lot about what you're actually doing. So um, in this example, there's in Jordan, there was a national law passed to sort of require the reporting of instances of family violence. And so an organization called the National Council for Family Affairs was charged with coordinating all these different, non-governmental organizations and state agencies to make sure that if something was happening, say, at the public health level or in the education system, eventually, that incident of violence would be reported to the police and they could respond accordingly, right? That law had certain mandates about how long you had like how long you had before you were required to report something. And then they were also moving off of another system that was very, very rigid in the way that it prescribed how you do things. And so when we started working with this organization, um, There was a process, but it turned out that so much of this had been dictated by the previous technology they were using that they'd sort of lost sight of what the actual thing they were trying to do was, right? And the more we talked about it, the more we talked about how things happened practically, and we were actually able to kind of get them to sort of rewrite out this process into a guide that was then used with the platform going forward across all these different agencies. So, you know, this is just one example of how that can happen. Um, so this example is more of a cautionary tale. And so I will say, just to start off, that this is an implementation. It is still running, but as you'll see, not in the way that it was originally envisioned. So we worked on a project back again back this was I think one was in 2018, like the Bangladesh one. Um, we were working with UNICEF and its partners in the Horn of Africa to try to provide to help these partners manage cases of migrant children as they were moving across borders, right? So that comes with a lot of really inherent challenges. Usually, there is a single person who has regular meetings with a client. Um, they can they can plan regular check-ins with the client. There's this consistent contact there, right? And there's consistency around who is talking to this person. Because these children were moving across borders, and because they were planning on using this in different countries in this region, we kind of worked with them to understand how are the children migrating, where are they going from place to place, what kinds of information do you need when somebody encounters this child and wants to provide services for them, even though they're not their regular social worker. And you can even see we included a map here that was basically that we produced from our conversations with people in Somaliland, which is a sort of semi-autonomous region within Somalia, to try to understand how this was going to work. Part of this project was they assumed that people in Somaliland, that semi-autonomous region, were going to be talking to people in Puntland, which is another semi-autonomous region, and in sort of the kind of more government-controlled part of Somalia, and also in Ethiopia, and all these people across all these different governments would be sharing information. Um, we planned for this. We talked to them about how this is going to work. What was sort of left out of uh, what was sort of ignored by a lot of these partners was the fact that some of these governments are at war with each other. They are very, 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 very cautious about sharing information with each other. And so we tried to get a sense of what that process was, but it turned out in real life that was a process that was entirely imagined. So what ended up happening is, this is now used as a case management system by government ministries in Somaliland. And so there was a happy ending in that this was used as a system by people and people benefited from it. But because there was no human process that existed outside of the technology before, or rather just any kind of human process that existed outside the technology, um, it never really took flight. Like the technology can only take you so far. You can lead a horse to water, but you know how that ends. Um, I'll kind of continue with this question, and this uses kind of those two same examples. Both of these projects were very instructive. You also do have to ask sort of like a counter scenario when you're doing a lot of this analysis, which is like, is there something about technology in general that will make a particular situation worse? And we always try to ask this question before we go in and we're trying to help people implement. So as an example, in Bangladesh, a lot of social workers were worried that carrying a phone around would make it seem like they were flaunting their wealth because they have this phone, which is presumably valuable. And so we sort of talked through scenarios where if you don't think this is inappropriate, this is how you would collect data and then enter it later. Another example was in Somaliland, where there were some partners who wanted to use biometric data, while there were others who objected that kind of having something that was so fundamental, um, whether a fingerprint or an eye scan, in a digital system, could potentially cause harm to people. So this is always something that we try to keep an eye on, and talk through with our clients because we know that this tool can be incredibly helpful. It can provide so much value to your team, but also sometimes you just have to say, all right, we're going to leave it out for this part.
So once you've built a solid understanding of your process, you're ready to get in the weeds with your data. And I use the word ready sort of loosely because who's ready really at any given time? Um, I think it can be useful to sort of thoughtfully review the state of your data really at any time. But implementing digital case management or any similar change to the way that you collect and manage information really encourages you to think about your data comprehensively. So how do you collect it? Is it quality data or is it just a lot of data? Do you update that data once it's collected? What happens when it needs to be updated? How do you protect the data that you've collected? How could you be doing that more effectively? I think that's an important question almost always. Do you analyze your data? What kind of analysis would help you meet your goals or demonstrate impact? Like process, this is an area where folks in your organization may be happily skipping through the fields, collecting whatever it is that they usually collect on autopilot, maybe not realizing that there's duplication or overlap in their various collection methods, or that there's opportunities for improved effectiveness overall at the organization level. When you first start trying to coalesce around these topics, you may be surprised at the variety or the similarity or both of the answers that you get when you're talking to program coordinators about their data. Next slide, Jack. So let's talk through a couple of data collection examples. The first one is extremely common. An organization runs multiple programs, which may have areas of overlap, but at least partially operate independently. Each of these programs has, at minimum, its own registration or intake form, but the systems beyond those initial forms may also be distinct. Especially if clients can be enrolled in multiple programs at once, what this organization might end up with is identical or overlapping information collected multiple times in multiple formats that have no relationship to each other. So now the organization, perhaps unknowingly, has this high volume of duplicative data. And then to make matters more complicated, even if they wanted to try to do some cross-program analysis, the disparate formats and values make that impossible. So what can that look like? That's on the next slide, Jack. In the example here, you can see two different ways of collecting information about race and ethnicity. In the left example, it's a combo question where clients are selecting any descriptors that apply amongst everything that's listed. On the right, it's a divided question that requests one response for race and one response for ethnicity. Performing any kind of meaningful comparative analysis on the data that's collected via these two different methods is going to require some work to bring the data sets into alignment. If an organization is aiming to perform meaningful analysis more out of the box, then you're going to have to do the work to unify data collection or at least focus on aligning the most important areas. So that might look like asking, where do differences in terminology matter, like in the example above, or when deciding whether you want to ask participants to identify gender or sex? How does data need to be categorized in reports to donors or reports to other stakeholders? What format gives us the most accurate information from respondents? What gets them to answer the question that you're actually asking? Or similarly reduces skew that can be caused by that just checking the box type of behavior. or what standards are we held to by relevant authorities, coordinating bodies? Can the data be collected in a way that more closely corresponds to those standards? Next slide. You also have to think about the data collection methods that are currently in use. If everyone is just collecting data on their various paper forms, that's one conversation. You're having one conversation over here. If different teams are using and accustomed to specialized tools, that's a different conversation. I think particularly if those tools are a necessary component of providing a certain type of service rather than an arbitrary technology choice, meaning they won't go away. They're required to perform this type of service. For example, farm survey teams tend to use agriculture specific tools. And so when SALIS is used for child labor remediation work, it has to integrate with those systems. On top of all of that, the question of whether or not participants are able to self-register without the involvement of a case manager or program coordinator adds its own layer of complexity. You may find yourself asking, does this require its own tool? Are the questions designed differently when they're asked by a facilitator versus presented to a respondent who's answering independently?
Megan, do you mind if I actually jump in with something that I
Yeah,
just
go
thought of
ahead.
as an example right now?
Mhm.
So I can say as an example, kind of with some clients that we're working with right now, we do have self-registration tools that we can set up for you in Salis. Um, we currently have two clients, one of whom clients has the client sign up on their own. But when they are doing that, it's mainly just to see information about their case. Like they just want to, you know, see whether they've gotten accepted into a program or, whether they have a meeting coming up with their case manager. We have another client who their clients are also signing up on their own, but they're also doing it to, you know, go sign up for events and like pay for tickets to stuff and like do all the stuff that they've already built out through their website. And in that, in the first situation, we said, okay, let's use, Salus's self-registration tool. And in the second scenario, we said, you know what, it's, like, let's not mess with how you're doing things too much. Let's just integrate these systems. Like that makes more sense. So I hope that's a good example.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Um, on the other side of the morass of initial data collection, then you have to think about updating data. One of the more straightforward questions you can answer is, does a value get recorded only once? So in the example that you can see here, we've highlighted the demographic information at the top of the form, name, age, date of birth, and gender. This information is very likely to be static over time. So, do we really need to collect client's name, age, and gender every time we meet? It's not being updated. We already have this accurate information. When you work on paper, that kind of duplication might make sense. You want to make sure that all of the paper forms are identifiable to a particular client. But if you're transitioning to a digital case management tool, there's no reason to repeat these fields on every form. Next slide. The next section of that same example form invites us to think about duplicate data entry in a different way. The questions as written are free response, and I think you know by nature that format's going to give you some phrasing variety as data is collected. You can also envision the workflow where the case manager is taking this information and then taking time later to record the presenting issue, other issues discussed every time they see a client. If this type of information needs to be analyzed, like in the case of an organization maybe who wants to understand how mental health support improves well-being over time, it's worth considering whether this question needs to be free response. In the right circumstance, there's a possibility that, a drop down selection from a set of possible responses might make this an easier and quicker field to update and still accurately reflect the information that you're trying to collect about your client. And then that will produce better options for analysis because you have less variety in the responses. I think a key takeaway from both sections of this example, both of these two slides, is that paper is a fundamentally different format than digital. Next slide. Um, I think sort of last part of updating that you really want to be thoughtful about is, does the information that you collect change over time? And if that's true, do you need a record of what the value used to be? Um, there's two examples here. An organization at the top here, an organization collecting information about housing status might find it important to know whether that status changes over time, in response to or in parallel with the services that a client is receiving. So they'll want to structure data differently if visualizing that change is important. Being able to see that the person represented by this case responded unhoused on first meeting, but has now transitioned to independent living. Or an organization, as in the bottom here, collecting information about household income might have the same need. If it's important to know whether household income has changed over time, like for example, if the organization is providing job training or trying to help clients get placed in better jobs, and they'll want to see later what impact their services have had on the client's earning, that's an important factor in how this type of data should also be managed in your digital system.
Okay, let's talk about protecting data. So what I will say is, so first of all, as you know, as people who work on the implementation side of things, I think platform security is a whole other conversation that our tech lead Pavel is much more has much more useful information to share. So we're going to focus on things that we can do for you when we are implementing, which really focuses on the configuration and the human processes. So to start out with configuration, we have built Salus to have both role-based, form-based, and then kind of access group-based restrictions on who can see what data, right? So to start off, the access group part I've written out here as scope. This basically says, what records in the system can I see? If your organization has a bunch of different programs and they don't want people from the other team coming in and necessarily looking at their cases for confidentiality reasons, this is a good way of kind of siloing that, right? We'll talk in a bit about how this is relevant for some organizations and this is not relevant for others. But in particular, if you are dealing with with cases dealing with really sensitive issues, if they are in, if this is somebody who's going through therapy, right, and they're talking about traumatic experiences, you don't want one therapist to be jumping in and looking at another therapist's cases. You don't necessarily want somebody who's working in one office to be looking at the cases from another office. You may want to kind of group them so that they can consult, but people can consult with each other and look at those cases. But you want to be able to structure it so that there are kind of silos within which users can share access to a case. Second, there's actions, right? So in this screenshot, I've kind of included some examples of things that you really want to be able to restrict. So for instance, if you have somebody who goes on vacation or who leaves your organization and you need to be able to reassign a case from one user to another, we call that assigning. And that is not something you want to give just anybody, right? Because if you have it where anybody can assign a case to another user, somebody comes into the system one day and says, hey, where did all my cases go? Somebody just moved my case around and now I can't see it. So we've made it so that for different types of users, they have different actions they can perform on the case. The third facet of this is field level, kind of field access, which we do by grouping fields into forms. And so we also have the ability to say, in this example, maybe a particular type of user can view some information about the person's employment background, but they can't update it. Whereas they're going to be performing regular assessments, and so they need to be able to update that assessment information. Whereas if you have information in this example about where someone's living, their housing status, that might be something maybe you hide from this person just because it's not appropriate, it's not relevant to their work, and so it's not appropriate for them to be viewing or updating it. So that is all stuff that, we would talk through with you and that we have done throughout our years of experience, kind of figuring out how to structure these restrictions in a way that makes it easy for people to work while also protecting data where you need to. The other side of this is human systems and processes, right? So I can set up a really, really sophisticated access structure for you with um, I just all kinds of protections around who can see what data. Um, I cannot protect you from somebody writing down their password on a post-it note and putting it on their computer. Like all of this needs to be kind of backed up by human processes. And so this is a very obvious example, but talking about this more practically for an organization doing case management outside of just teaching people basic uh, security rules like don't write down passwords on post-its, um, you know, you should probably have a plan for how data gets shared either within your organization or outside of your organization. So with our UNICEF work in the past, typically this is managed with first a data protection impact assessment, and then usually following that information sharing protocol. And these are very particular UNICEF terms, but there's equivalents outside of the international humanitarian field. And the first part of this is basically saying, like, hey, what are the risks of collecting this data and storing it? Um, and then the second part, in particular with relation to sharing, uh, is saying, okay, how are we going to reduce this risk? Like, what actions can we put in place now that we know what the danger is of having this particular data? How are we going to restrict access to it? So, if you are collecting information on a list of let's say someone's legal status or their immigration status, right? That's obviously potentially sensitive information, right? I've now identified that the risk here is that somebody who wants to do harm to this person now has access to this piece of information that can cause them harm. In the information sharing protocol, you would say, these are the exact people who can access this information, and this is how we are going to restrict that. And then I've included the second bullet point, which is, make sure everyone in your organization understands basic aspects of data protection. And, a really dumb, like, security example is don't write down passwords. Megan, I think you're taking this one.
Yeah, so this is one of the examples that Jack was sort of alluding to a minute ago. Just like context is important when you're thinking about your data collection, it's also obviously extremely important to data protection. So UNICEF's gender-based violence teams work with survivors of sexual violence. They serve individuals in very vulnerable positions, and they have very strict data protection measures in place. Those include no names on the cases list, the ability to hide all names on view-only pages, and highly, highly restricted sharing permissions. No other implementations use these features because they consider them frustrating or disruptive. This does not mean that the other implementation teams are not taking measures to protect their data, just that their requirements for what constitutes well-protected data are based on a different contextual understanding of risk, sort of based on the information that they intake about their beneficiaries versus these gender-based violence teams.
Okay, so example two is sort of an example of information sharing protocols at work and how they can kind of keep your data safe and keep your clients safe. So I think I've been using this Bangladesh example a lot. So within this context, when we were helping to implement the application here, there were a lot of different organizations that would potentially be referring a case to another organization to help provide services. And so there were very kind of long, drawn out, tense negotiations around how data was going to be shared. In particular, and I'm not going to name names because I don't want to get into that, but this is public information. This is out there. This is something that people know about. So there were concerns about a very particular organization that was involved in this context and how they were sharing data with governments, right? And so a lot of organizations said, hey, we really, really, really don't want to share information with this organization if we don't have to. And so based on that, we developed features to kind of restrict how data can be shared um, with this particular organization. Um, I think I mentioned the biometrics thing in Somalia earlier, and I think that was relevant here too, because that was the kind of information that was eventually shared with this government that had persecuted this group of people. And so when this happened, like this particular organization that everybody was concerned about shared this data in an inappropriate way. And our systems data was not involved in this, right? So I think this data came from an entirely different system. But this is exactly how these sorts of agreements can affect outcomes for people, right? Like this had an effect. Like this kind of conversation about how you're sharing data is really meaningful.
We've been alluding to data analysis throughout this section because it's an extremely helpful framing tool when you're thinking about the ideal way to manage data for your organization. If you regularly send reports to donors or stakeholders, what information goes into those reports? How can you ensure that you're collecting and updating data so that when you want those analytics, they're at your fingertips? Who are you trying to reach? Are you able to identify specific demographic groups or community subsets in your data set? How do you measure your team's process and efficiency? How do you measure whether client outcomes or overall well-being are improved by your work? All of these questions represent analysis and reporting needs that will absolutely influence how you decide to collect data. Your ability to identify what you're hoping to get out of your system helps us work backward to figure out what you need to put in.
There are also some more prosaic day-to-day ways that you can analyze data that are not just for something like, well, I need to send this report to somebody, right? Or I want to be able to evaluate how quickly my team is performing assessments or something like that, right? Process-based indicators. Sometimes you just really want to be able to find all of the people in your organization who are receiving therapy, right? And so, one thing that we try to talk through with clients is how do you usually categorize, slice and dice your data just in your day-to-day work? If you every single day are like, okay, I need to look at all of my cases that are receiving career development services. Okay, that's good information to know. We will make sure that we are storing the data in a way and then presenting it to you in a way where it's really easy for you to get that information quickly. And a lot of this builds into other just other features that we have, like our task reminders and our approvals. We want to know how you are doing your day-to-day work and how you need to regularly divide your data so we can store the data properly for you.
So you've thought about your processes, you understand what kind of data you want to collect and analyze, and you're ready to think about translating a new digital tool to your particular context. That's localization. For the purposes of this presentation, we're talking about it as it covers adaptation of functionality to local needs, meaning how users experience the platform and what they and their clients need from it in order to be well understood. Language and location are probably the two biggest examples. Cultural or program-specific context may also be represented in a localization exercise. So I think Jack is going to talk us through language as an option here.
Yes. Um, yeah, so I will say, I'll mention again, this platform works in over 40 languages uh, and dialects. We have done a lot of internationalization work, a lot of work to make sure this shows up well for people who are speaking other languages. One thing that we have found consistently throughout our work is that the way people use language to view this information, update this information, is very contextual. So we did an implementation in Iraq, in northern Iraq, in the kind of Kurdistan region, where it was a lot of Kurdish speakers, but they would tell us, yeah, but I went to school for social work in English. And so when I'm talking about the different ways that I'm going to assess a child situation, I'm thinking in English. I'm not thinking in Kurdish. I need to be able to view this form in English as I am sitting there talking to the child. Um, you know, on the other side, you may want to make sure that your client can view the information in their language, even though that's not your native language. Um, so it's not just about what I need to experience the language as, it's what my client or the language that I need to experience the platform in. It's also about how my client sees all this information and making it very transparent to them. Uh, I may also just work with people in my team who speak different languages. So you're constantly moving back and forth between all of those, between those different languages, and you need to switch the app really quickly. Anybody who has, listened to people speak in Spanglish or like I speak Arabic and listening especially to humanitarian people speak in a mix of Arabic and English is really entertaining. And it happens all the time. So main point here, people don't fit in any neat boxes with this. You need to be really, really flexible with them. Um, to kind of continue talking about Arabic, uh, one thing that we had to address when we updated the application to use Arabic is how people experience a language, right? Because language changes how you think. Uh, to give an example, Arabic is right to left. It isn't written out left to right. And so anytime an Arabic speaker is looking at a website or reading the newspaper or just, looking at anything, just like you will look at a newspaper starting in the top left corner and move right and down, they will start at the right and move left and down. So you can see in this example, we have this little four-part cartoon strip. An Arabic speaker will look at that top right square first, move to the right, then go down bottom left, then bottom right, um, which means absolutely everything on the website or everything in the application has to be switched. So you can see buttons are reversed. Anything that indicates like chronological order or directional signals has to be reversed. So here we have this button for when you're saving an incident that says save and return, meaning like save and return to the case. For an English speaker, we do it to the left because we're saying, let's go back to where I was a minute ago. For an Arabic speaker, you're doing it the opposite way. That arrow points to the right. So all of this is just sort of to say it's not just about updating the language and all this work we've done. It's about saying, how do you experience this? Um, yeah, one other example here. Uh, because we have had to translate this so many times, we've had to pay very close attention to the language we use when we're putting stuff into the app. So this is an example of a message telling you that your case is updated. And when someone translated it, they read it very literally. And so it came out the other end once it was translated. Instead of update to case ABCD123 failed, please contact support, it changed to failed to case, the update, ABCD123. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Um, so that's really changed how we think. We try to make our language as simple as possible uh, and really reduce the ways in which it could be misinterpreted, have people fumble over it.
So if at this point you're shouting at me, my whole team speaks English. Why does this matter? It's because language localization is a really clear way to illustrate a broader point, which is that everything we're discussing is about adjusting to how people experience and understand things that are highly contextual. So let's try thinking about it in a different way, through the lens of one of my favorite topics, which is American Regional English. It's an assumption, but if I put a plate on the table in front of all of us containing two pieces of bread with some stuff in between them, we'd probably be able to agree that that's a sandwich. However, if I swap the two pieces of bread for some sort of long roll, history and geography tell me that our agreement on that might immediately get murkier. In the US today, sub is the most widely used word to describe this type of sandwich. But for example, I am from a specific area of the US where this type of sandwich is known almost exclusively as a hoagie. So the word sub may be understood, but if you want to meet folks in this area where they are and capture data that accurately reflects their experience, you absolutely want to be using the regionalism. Um, Terminology is highly contextual. How is language used by the population you serve? This can look like the hoagie, but also like the decision that I mentioned earlier about whether to use gender versus sex on a demographic form, or how to ask a difficult or sensitive question in a way that will result in the person you're asking it to feeling capable of answering. Missions are highly contextual. What counts as a win in context A might be a standard baseline in context B. Case management is highly contextual, and in fact, I think most effective when it accounts for context. What community or cultural context is relevant to your caseload? Is that context well integrated? Is competence emphasized for caseworkers or prioritized in the case management process itself? Um, Next slide, Jack.
I just want to jump in real quick. We have about 6 minutes left, and we do have some questions. Did just want to give us a time update.
Okay, I will try to push through capacity building here. Every step along a path of implementing digital case management has been an opportunity for learning. Capacity building is really no different. It's the union of everything that has come before it. So you've thought about your process. You've thought about how you're collecting information multiple ways, multiple forms, multiple times. You've acknowledged to each other, hey, that's a great point. Why haven't we considered this before? Or what are the most common reasons that XYZ is happening in our organization? How are we handling our data? Next slide, Jack. Taking some cues from kind of lifelong learning more generally, this process can be a cycle, right? So you identify something that you want to change, you spend some time together internally, building the vocabulary to effectively communicate what it is you want to change and why and how you plan to go about it. You decide how best to incorporate that change into your process, whether that's a change in your method, the technology used, the desired outcome. You coming to that decision and then implementing it helps to clarify your vision, I think, kind of in both directions. And then the evolving real world experience of serving your client might prompt a review or inspire a new goal or reveal a risk or an opportunity. So, in one version of this cycle, you might find yourself implementing a brand new system or tool. It's all big picture, big questions, collaborative with folks like us who are helping you configure a tool. In a subsequent version of the cycle, you may just be making a small adjustment. Hey, now that we've seen this in the field, this terminology, this form doesn't actually work for us. Let's use that knowledge to make it an improvement. Next slide. Um, One thing I want to call back to and expand upon a little bit is one of the ideas from the beginning of this presentation. A SaaS company can't tell you how to provide your clients with appropriate care. You have the domain specific knowledge. You are bringing all the correct programmatic guidance to these conversations. But a company like Salis, experienced in providing tools for case management across a variety of contexts over a period of time, can absolutely help you translate that domain specific knowledge into something more. So, driving process improvement, working toward better client outcomes, transparency for stakeholders.
So I will talk about some of our direct training exercises that we do. So I'll actually start from the end. So the most obvious one is just end user training. We want to help people at your organization understand how best to use the tool. Then a little bit more advanced is administrator training. This is where we would go through kind of directors of your organization or anybody who's going to be the technical point person for the platform and show them how to configure it, show them how to kind of change all the settings behind the scenes. And then this one that we started off with, the discovery workshop, is a lot of that stuff that we've been talking about of what are our processes? Do we get three people from three different departments in the same room, ask them what their case management process is, and it turns out that they're all totally different and nobody had really clocked that. So this is very open-ended. It's very interactive where we would just go through and say like, hey, when are you registering this person? Like, is it at an event? Is it online? Do they do it themselves? Is that different for different people? Much more broad-based. And to that point, it's important to say that, a direct training session a lot of times becomes a forum for people to talk through these processes, talk through what they do as an organization and get a better understanding of it. How you collaborate, how oversight works in your organization, and how maybe you want to use your data better to get insight on your processes and the outcomes of your clients, and see how their lives are improving as a result of your work. Um,
Sometimes capacity building happens indirectly, and color is a really easy example for illustrating this. Humans naturally create more words for things that they interact with all the time. You see examples of this across all kinds of languages globally. The color red occurs frequently in nature, which over time yields more words for different shades of red. In the reverse, when people have access to more words to describe something, our minds can more easily distinguish between different versions of those things. So pink is a tint of red, but distinct enough that languages with a word for pink can more easily distinguish between different shades of pink, which is an added layer of specificity on top of your understanding of red. Having vocabulary for something trains your brain to think clearly about it. Applying this back to implementing digital case management tools, configuration planning requires you to think systematically. So, asking and answering questions that have implications for data structures helps your staff think more clearly about their data, build a vocabulary for data management, and sort of via that back door, potentially enhance their existing vocabulary for processes. When you're thinking systematically in a conversation that requires a certain type of specificity, you're building additional vocabulary for a concept that you may already broadly understand. And if, as I mentioned earlier, folks in your organizations approach those conversations with openness, you're also flexing the muscles involved in kind of clear, productive communication generally. Do we actually understand each other? Do we have the same expectation of what's to come? Just a quick recap. So, implementing tools for digital case management at its core gives you a physical tool set to use. That's the baseline. We've spent a bunch of time, I think, hopefully illustrating for you the other tools that process can help you develop or strengthen. You're asking, what kind of data are we collecting and why, right at the top? You're asking about your processes. You're identifying places where they've been built specifically to accommodate your context. You're ensuring that everyone has a similar understanding of how you already work and what you want to change or preserve about that. All of this is building more comprehensive understanding. If you're answering these questions honestly, you're going to get to how do our processes and the data we collect actually help us serve our clients? And ultimately, hopefully, how do we make sure that process is as meaningful as the work we do? And by that, I mean it's very easy to get swept up in the idea of data, of analytics, of insights and digital tools and sort of steam ahead without doing the process analysis or any of the communication that's really required to make it consequential. In my experience, this can look like organizations that kind of insist on implementing their paper forms exactly as they are in a digital format and then wondering why they're not getting good data or seeing changes in their outcomes. This can also look like organizations becoming obsessed with data and inputting a lot, exporting a high volume of it without it's burning valuable employee time, and then it doesn't actually address the core questions that they're asking, the questions that would be most helpful for them to answer with data. So if you're going to spend the time and the money to go through configuration process or go through this sort of rethinking, in my opinion, it's really a loss not to engage fully with that kind of exploratory critical thinking step. I know this can be hard. It's way easier said than done. But what you do is really important. And if you can come out of it on the other side with better tools, meaning both the digital tools and also your personal toolbox, I think there are a lot of ways that this can have a significant benefit for your organization and the people you serve. Can we do case management better is an evolving question. The world is changing. You are learning new things all the time. And it's really satisfying, I think, when you feel prepared to meet that moment. So that's us.
Excellent. Okay, perfect. We have some questions here.
Okay.
Um, The first one here is how do I get everybody on board? We have folks that have been with us 20 plus years doing case management. I have recent college grads. The technology spectrum is very wide. How do I get everybody on board for doing a software implementation?
I can kind of jump in with this one. We've definitely seen this before. And I think so much of what does help is just an openness about it. And I think a lot of people are worried about, hey, what is required of me? Right? Is this going to be this whole new thing I have to learn? And if you kind of say like, well, it's easy to use. This is what we're looking at using it for. Do you want to be part of the process of figuring out how we're going to use it? People tend to be more open to it, as opposed to saying, no, I'm just going to ram this thing down your throat. Make it an open process. We're always happy to talk to people, from people who are dealing directly with cases to people who are doing the analysis on the reporting side, and see how everybody works. And once they're drawn into the process, they're just a lot more open to it.
I think as a corollary to that also, sometimes when you're having conversations with people, what they're if you're not approaching that conversation by saying, here's what we want to achieve by doing this, then people are hearing, oh my God, I'm going to have to sit through all these meetings and I'm going to put in all this effort and I'm going to learn this brand new thing and I have no idea what I'm going to get out of it at the other side. But if you're starting from this is what we want to do and this is the path we're going to take to get there, then I think usually that's more helpful on the buy-in conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. On the data analysis phase, do you typically have to worry about local regulations to audit who sees what data? For example, GDPR?
Oh man, yeah, that's local regulations. Yes, we've had to deal with that a bunch of times. So we are GDPR compliant. I kind of mentioned that the sort of that project we did in Jordan, which was really at its core one giant response to regulatory restrictions around who was required to have information sent to them and who was restricted from receiving information. I do remember a specific meeting where someone said to me, this is very important that this can be restricted because, you know, if this often happens in small towns where everybody knows everybody, and if one person there sees this thing, then absolutely everybody will hear about it. And this person, like their safety will be at risk. Um, so yes, we have had to respond to that. And fortunately, the tool is very flexible and lets us deal with that.
In terms of staying on the privacy path, we see data breaches, we see vendors in the news. What are things that when I'm evaluating vendors like this that I should look at in terms of privacy?
It's one is all the tools that I just mentioned. This like Salas has a lot of tools to kind of match whatever combination of restrictions you have. I always like to think of it as kind of like lattice work. You may have restrictions that run in one direction or in a particular vein, and then you have these other cross-cutting restrictions. And so having those multiple layers of application kind of protection capabilities helps match that. The other thing is, frankly, just we're pretty good about. I mean, I don't want to do a full toot your own horn thing, but like we're pretty good about working with the team and saying like, okay, like how do we meet you where you're at? And if this isn't fully um, meeting every need you have, like how can we update the platform to meet it? Um,
I think a willingness to have that conversation, if you're evaluating lots of different organizations, a willingness to have that conversation is usually a good sign. If someone is telling you, like, no, no, everything's fine, we're totally secure, and that's the end of the conversation, like
yeah.
sometimes that's a pretty big red flag.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is my question. So I've talked to organizations that have bought software and that like tried to do it themselves, like implement it themselves. What would you say to that? That we're just going to do it ourselves?
Ooh.
I think um, I'll start out with the general, Jack, and if you want
Yeah,
to
no, no, go ahead.
supplement a little bit, but um, I never want to I never want to tell people like, no, you can't do a thing, right? Because I want to honor the fact that folks are smart people with agency and like they could they could potentially. I think sometimes when people do it themselves, they're not prepared to have the kind of deep conversations that we were talking about throughout the presentation. They don't know how to elicit the right responses from each other, or they don't even know they don't even know the question. Like, you see people like going to rent an apartment for the first time or buying a house, and you walk through and you're not sure which things you should be focused on or you should be worried about. And then once you've done that, the next time you go to do it, you're like, oh my God, the like radiator was terrible in that last place. I know I have to ask this question. So I think doing it yourself, you do really have to kind of commit um, to having a lot of conversation and exploring. I think sometimes an outside perspective helps you focus on something that is outside of your what you're already doing day to day. It would be very easy to say, well, we're doing this and we're going to replicate it with this system, and that's that. And somebody from the outside comes in and says, well, wait a minute, why are you doing it that way? And so if you are trying to do it yourself, you have to try to interrupt your own thought processes a little bit. And I think that's easier when someone else is offering their expertise and also their outsider perspective. Jack, I don't know if you feel
No, no,
differently.
no, that's 100%. That's an extremely valid point. I mean, we just went through an entire we just went through an entire presentation of kind of lessons learned from 10 years doing this and having seen a lot of the ambitions that organizations have, and knowing from those experiences how sometimes that works out and sometimes you need to be thinking about this one thing that can go wrong, or how you can potentially implement this ambition of yours differently just by using the technology in a different way. The other thing I will say is we have a really, really excellent team of developers that are constantly kind of looking out for ways to fix this platform, ways to set up the infrastructure in a way that is secure and reliable. And if you don't know what I mean by that, if I say infrastructure and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, I can tell you that setting this up on your own will be, it just, it is can become an all-consuming process, right? The way that I like to think about this goes back to what we said twice at the beginning and at the end is your organization is the expert on the services that you provide to your client population, right? Uh, there's no one's supplanting that, no one's questioning that, and running a software company, and just running a software company, running a software product that is going to be there for you 24/7, and isn't going to have random outages is a very different job. And it's something that we've worked really hard at over 10 years, getting good at and knowing what we're doing. I was on a call yesterday, call kind of late yesterday with a client who was using another kind of third party, like a SaaS, like a CRM basically. And something had gone wrong with the software. It just stopped working randomly. And the response from the company had basically been, well, you'll need a developer to fix this, kind of not our problem. And it was being used as basically entirely an out of the box version of their software. And their response was basically like, ah, well, this is for you to deal with. And the people we were talking with from the organization were like, I don't know how to fix this random JavaScript error that's popping up on my screen. I don't even know what that is. And so, like that's a very good point. That shouldn't be your job. That shouldn't be something that you have to deal with, right? Like, and even if you're a team that has, an IT, like IT staff members or an IT organization, um, and that can be a really, really useful resource to have. And we honestly we love working with people within the IT people within another organization to kind of figure out how all of your various systems can work together well. Them kind of coming to us with problems and us helping them out is a very different thing than them standing up an entire system on their own and having to maintain it constantly and, look out for security patches and, because there's some dependency that broke that potentially makes data vulnerable. That is a very, very different set of responsibilities that, please, please, please don't do that to your IT person. Uh, anyway,
Perfect. Well,
that's my
T,
spiel.
thank you so much. That is a wrap. We will email this to you as well with the slides, and we thank you for attending. We hope it was everything you hoped it would be.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everybody.
Great job, Megan. Great job, Jack.
Thanks.
Thanks.